Reddit, my grandma died, and weeks after cleaning out her things, I found something hilarious, shocking, or fascinating about my family. Can anyone relate? It wasn't until after my grandfather died that we found out. My father and his brothers were setting my grandfather's affairs in order, and this involved visiting various offices he had had in different premises. Over the years, my grandfather and his sons had built up quite a diverse family business centered around import or export and wholesale. One of the holdings that was listed was a stationery store that was on the third story of a rather pricey building in the CBD, and that from the accounts, made a surprising amount of profit. This was news to my dad and his brothers, who'd never heard of the shop despite being involved in what they believed was every aspect of the family business. Upon arriving at the stationery store, they made a surprising discovery. The store was actually a very upmarket illegal brothel. Apparently, my grandfather had been making a deal to sell the brothel because his health no longer permitted him to run it, as he had done for the past 25 years. My family finished the deal and sold the stationery store, which to the best of my knowledge continued its trade until the entire building was sold a while back and redeveloped into a shopping arcade. The brothel is now a men's clothing store. Legit, I checked it out myself and bought my favorite tie there. And funnily enough, I can now see that building from the place where I work. It's not so much something I found, but something I found out about my gran at her funeral last week. My dad read the eulogy and described how she had been waiting at a bus stop in Winchester during World War II when she saw a German V1 approaching. The engine cut out and it began its deadly descent towards her. There was no place to take shelter, so everyone dropped to the ground. The bomb went off a few feet from the bus stop. When my gran stood up, she saw nothing but rubble and carnage. She was the only survivor, coming through with a few cuts and 2 broken ribs. She dusted herself off and went to work. Keep calm and carry on. Going through my grandfather's house after he died, my parents found a small opaque pill bottle, which had been labeled on the top, Old Penis. At first, they were very hesitant to open it, but did and discovered it contained several 1-cent coins with dates from the early 20th century. My grandfather did not speak English as a first language, and if you say it out loud, it makes sense. My grandfather passed last year, and we've been making our way through his accumulated items since. He was a bit of a hoarder. One of his favorite activities was going to estate auctions and buying tons of things that nobody else wanted for literally single dollars. So he amassed quite a bit of stuff. We haven't even managed to get into the attic yet, because it is packed floor to ceiling with boxes. So far, however, we've found a bunch of interesting or awesome stuff that nobody knew he had. Back of his closet, an original, unstrung 50s Fender Stratocaster. Pops was always into electronics, apparently. According to my grandma, he read about these newfangled electric guitars and placed a pre-order. He got one of the first ones released to the public. I believe my aunt now has it in a local bank vault. Basement scrap bin, a World War II Nazi Luftwaffe belt buckle. From what my grandma says, he killed someone who was wearing it and brought it home from the war. He loved the belt, but hated the buckle. So the buckle went into a scrap metal bin and stayed there for 50 years or so. Basement rafters, 5 shotguns, 2 rifles, 3 revolvers, and a .25 caliber automatic made in France. Nobody knew they were there. Sock drawer. My great-grandpa's, one of the first NYC motorcycle cops, 1917 .38 service revolver, and 2 backup revolvers. Also his blackjacks. A 300-watt soldering iron. A Prince Albert can full of American Indian arrowheads. They were building a reservoir across from his old house in the 50s. Every day he'd go across the street after work and pick them up out of the tilled earth. There's too many other weird things to list. This is all that comes to mind at the moment. My pop-pop died a few years ago at the age of 86. He was a great man and served his country as a navigator during World War II, which he never discussed, and later as a high school teacher and principal in the Midwest. He had 2 daughters, my mother and my aunt, both of whom he loved unconditionally. He never went a night away from my grandmother after coming back from the war. He said he'd done enough of that to last the rest of their lives, and shortly before his death, they celebrated their 63rd wedding anniversary. After his death, I found a couple of cool things in his keepsake chest. A signed photo and personal letter from Jimmy Stewart, who had served in his battalion in the Air Force. Didn't know that prior to his death. And a GPS unit. The GPS unit had been a gift from my mother some years before, because he loved gadgets and was still a navigator at heart. The GPS unit had gotten him involved in some treasure hunts with other navigators, who basically picked a spot in the middle of nowhere, buried a box with a trinket, and then sent someone else to find it, using only the coordinates provided. They would then exchange the trinket left by the previous person with a new treasure and record who had been there and what was left. Unbeknownst to us, my grandfather had left a box buried on our property in Vermont, he lived in Texas, during his last visit some 5 years earlier, and left us directions to find it. When we tracked down the box using the GPS after his death, the box opened up with personalized compasses for each of his family members, with the inscription, "Not all those who wander are lost." When I was younger, I helped clean my grandmother's house before she had to move. I then discovered a cupboard filled with an assortment of jars and bottles. A lot of these things seemed like Asian medicines. Bottled ginseng, random roots preserved in alcohol, that kind of stuff. She even had a jar of wine with baby rats in it. However, that wasn't the oddest thing in there. One large jar had this stark red, thick liquid in it. It was labeled in Chinese, which I couldn't read at the time. I brought it to my mother and asked her what it was. She gave me this look and told me not to tell anyone, which I suppose I just broke that promise. Apparently, the translation of the Chinese characters read as black people blood. No clue what it was for, but like every ancient Chinese remedy, my guess it's for stamina. I found a letter my dad had written to the court-appointed psychologist during my parents' divorce from 10 years ago. Two most shocking things I found was that I was tested for HIV when I was 5 because I was having oral surgery, and they tested my parents' blood to make sure it was okay in case I needed blood. My mom tested positive for HIV. She still hasn't told my brother and I. Also, my dad described that when they found his brother's body when he had a heart attack, they couldn't actually take the body because it had decomposed too much. He had a heart attack, and no one found him for a week or so. He mentioned that he was the only person who knew the coffin was empty during the funeral. I remember asking him why it wasn't open casket. My parents, along with my mom's mother and stepfather, Grandpa Joe, used to go up to a cottage in the summer. It was a place where you could rent a cottage and a boat for a week or weekend, and we went up there a couple times a summer. My dad and Grandpa Joe used to go fishing there every time we went up, getting up at the crack of dawn and fishing until noon. I was never invited or interested. I was much happier playing with the other kids at the other cottages. Eventually, they got tired of renting crappy boats, so they had got their own tinny, which they stored up there year-round for a couple bucks. By the time I was 12, both my dad and Grandpa Joe had passed away, but through some fluke, the boat stayed up there, in storage without us paying. When I was in my 20s, someone figured it out, and said it had to be removed. I live in a city and don't have the funds to go to the cottage on a regular basis, or a place to store a boat, so I made a deal with the owner. For a reduced rate, some friends and I would spend a weekend at a cottage, get the boat working, and at the end of it, give it to the owners to do with as they wish. Deal done, and we headed up. After a bit of work, we got the boat going, and headed out on the lake. About halfway out, a film canister rolled out from under the seat, with 20-year-old weed in it. Some more digging uncovered a pipe that had obviously been used. About a month later, I told my mom. She smiled at me, patted me on the head, and said, "I know, Keggy. That's why he never invited you out, and why your grandmother and I used to go for long walks in the afternoon." That is so awesome in so many ways. They were able to be free and indulge, and at the same time shielded you from it. Not me, but happened to my father several years back. He had an employee whose grandpa had passed away, so she asked him to help with cleaning out her grandpa's house for family heirlooms and whatnot. He felt like being helpful, so he agreed to do so. They were cleaning out the attic when my father finds an old-looking trunk tucked away in a corner. He opens it and is quite shocked to find a KKK outfit. My father's employee was absolutely horrified, as she had always known her grandfather as a very kind and loving man. I forgot what they did with the outfit, probably threw it away, but her view of her grandfather was permanently changed from that day on. At my grandmother's funeral, her boyfriend turned up. Although this doesn't sound strange in itself, we had no idea she was seeing anyone. Her husband, second marriage and of no relation to myself, had died shortly before I was born, and as far as the rest of the family knew, she wasn't seeing anyone. The plot thickens. Shortly before her passing, I went round to visit. She answered the door after several minutes of knocking and was visibly out of breath. Later that visit, about 4 hours later, I heard a knock in a walk-in cupboard behind her sofa. I tried to investigate, but was promptly told that it was just the ironing board falling over and not to worry. I told my family about this, but being 13 years old, they didn't think too much of it. Fast forward to 3 months after her death, my aunt, in a particularly low moment, trying to feel closer to her mother, started reading some of the newer entries in her diary. It turns that my surprise 7-hour visit interrupted a particularly passionate bout of bumping uglies, and in the heat of the moment, my grandmother shoved her boyfriend into the closet and told him to wait there until the coast was clear. Apparently, she didn't want the family to find out about him, as he was married and of particularly high social standing in the local area. I found an old newspaper with my grandma's face in it. She was being arrested for armed robbery. That's why she missed my 3rd birthday. Poor Granny was trying to get some cash to buy you the best 3rd birthday gift ever.